In this lesson, let's talk more about transforming our objects in Maya. So let's actually start with a blank scene, and then we'll take a look at actually creating some geometry, and then we'll kind of move it around a little bit. So we looked at really quickly creating geometry from our shelves. We can also go up to create, and there are different types of geometry that we can create. NURBS primitives, which is a particular type that is created basically from kind of patches of geometry that are folded and twisted around to create different shapes. We've also got polygon geometry. We'll talk about these components in the next lesson, but the difference will become apparent then. But let's say that we want to create one of these types of geometry. On both of these kind of menus at the bottom, you'll see this little option for interactive creation. And so what that means is if I select for instance, a polygon sphere, nothing is created until I click and drag on the grid. Then it creates it. I can hit delete to get rid of that. If I create something that is, let's say, a cube, for instance, this requires me to click and drag to create kind of the base of the cube. Once I release, I need to click and drag again to drag up the height, so I can choose each dimension separately. Whereas the sphere, it's basically just a sphere, so I can drag out the radius in one go. So that's nice. If you like to work that way, that's fine. I usually like to turn that off. So if you turn that off, you can go to Polygon Primitives and turn off Interactive Creation. So if you do that, then you go to Create, and then whatever you select, let's select a cube, it's just going to drop a unit cube right at the origin. So it's at 0, 0, 0. This is 0, 0, 0 in our X, Y, and Z axis. So thinking about that in 3 dimensions. And you can see here, if I click on the input, it shows us the different values used to create this. So it's a 1 by 1 by 1 cube. So 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter with no divisions. Well, 1 division in each direction, but basically no divisions between points. So that'll enable you to really quickly create geometry just right at the origin. So now if I go to polygons and click on sphere, again, I'm doing it from the shelf, but it recognizes that I don't want to use interactive creation, and it just pops it right in to the origin there. Okay. Now if I want to move this object around, we can click on our transform tools, our move tool, rotate tool, or scale tool, or I can hit W on the keyboard to bring up the move tool. I can grab this along a particular axis, and I can simply move it along the x-axis, along the z-axis, the y-axis. I can click in the middle and drag it around. I can also click on these little planes. So for instance, if I move it along this plane, you can see I'm moving it along this axis and this axis, but not along this one. So I'm not moving it along there, but I can move it anywhere along that plane. If I use this one, I can move it around on the floor, but I can't move it up and down. Same thing here. So it's a combination of 2 different axes to be able to move this around. Now right now, this axis for the object matches up exactly with the world axis. So Z is on the object is pointing in the same way as Z in the world. Let's begin to rotate this around. So to activate rotate, we can choose rotate, or we can hit E on our keyboard. You can see our gizmo change a little bit. So now we have these rings. If I grab inside of those rings, I can move this around any direction that I want. You can see all those values update over here in our channel box. If I want to only rotate it in a particular axis, I can grab that axis, and you can see that in this case the z-axis is highlighted in yellow as I click it, and now I'm only rotating it there. I can click on the x-axis, the y-axis, and let me zero this out here for a second. Zoom in on it there. So yeah, there we go. You can see I can click on that z-axis, and it just moves the z-axis. Here I'm just moving the x-axis, and here just the y. Now I can also rotate it in screen space by clicking on this outer ring here. Okay, so that doesn't rely on the axis so much as it relies on the angle of the camera. So I can start to kind of move things around. I can rotate things. Okay, now you'll notice if I rotate this around and I go back to move, the axis still matches up with the world. That's good if I want to move it along the world. But what if I want to move it along its own axis, which in this case has been rotated? Well, we can go into move, And instead of choosing the move axis as world, we can choose it as object. And now the y-axis remains along that pole, just as if we hadn't rotated it. So that means the axis sort of rotates along with the object. So in many cases, you'll want that versus moving it based on the world. In some cases, you'll want that. So you can go in here and modify that based on your needs. We can also hit the R key to go to scale, and we can scale it uniformly by clicking on the center cube, or we can scale it in a particular axis or two particular axes by clicking on either these cubes or on these planes. And you can see those update here. Now, with the translate and rotate, we kind of talked about this. 0 is going to be your default. With scale, 0 would be, you can't see it at all. It's not even there. So the default for scale is going to be 1. So if you wanted to take that back to 1, we could click on those transforms, put 1 in there, and it'll pop it back. Okay? So with any of these, you could put in, if you knew a specific amount that you wanted to translate this, you could put that in numerically, or you can click on the channel, middle mouse drag, just anywhere in the dead space, and it'll allow you to change those values as well. So there's several different ways that we can kind of transform and move things around. So you can see that Maya kind of keeps track of all the transforms on here, so that we can, if we wanted to take this all back to the origin, we could just zero that out. But let's say I've moved this over and I've rotated it, and I want this now to be its default position, and I've also maybe scaled it a little bit. I want this to be the default. So I want everything to be zeroed out, but I don't want it to be moved back. Well, we can accomplish that by freezing the transformations. So we'll go to Modify, Freeze Transformations. That sets everything back to 0 and the scale back to 1, but it doesn't move the object and it doesn't change the size of the object. So now this is the default translate values, rotate values, and scale, and we can go from there. That can be useful as well. And we'll look at that as we go through this process as well. All right, so that's a look at transforming objects. Again, those tools are found over here on the left in the toolbox. We can access those using W for translate, E for rotate, and R for scale. Okay, and then you can also quickly go back to your just selection by hitting Q on your keyboard. So now that we've taken a look at transforming objects in Maya, next let's take a look at working with the components that make up those objects. So up to this point, we've been working just with the objects overall. Let's kind of dial down and really start to look at what those objects are made of and how we can manipulate those components. So we'll do that next.